Hi, my name is Sani Hamid. I'm the Director for Economy and Market Strategy at Financial Alliance. Today I'm going to talk to you about something called fear of the known and unknown. This is a follow-through episode on the previous one, which spoke about what we call shutdown risk. In this episode, we're going to try and see what is the characteristics of the coronavirus, the COVID-19, in order for us to really try and understand whether the market has fully understood or has fully priced in what is to be expected, or basically has been underestimating the impact of the virus, which we think is the case. A lot of what I'm saying is taken out from a report I wrote on February the 7th, titled Shutdown Risk Underestimated. Let's start off with a table I had in the report. In this table, we have both good news and bad news. Basically, if you look at all the types of viruses in terms of pandemics and epidemics that have come out over the years, you could basically, or you can basically divide them into several groups. Namely, if you look at SARS and MERS, and even you can put Ebola inside this group, you'll find that these are groups of viruses which actually have very low infection rates or are less infectious. However, they have very high mortality rates. SARS had about 10% mortality of those infected, MERS about 34, and I think Ebola is about 50-odd%. So 1 in every 2 person would die, but luckily it is not infectious thoroughly or highly infectious. The second group we have is basically, under this group we have H1N1 and we have what we call the seasonal flu. These are viruses which have very low mortality rate, but on the other hand they are extremely infectious, or they're very infectious. H1N1, for example, studies today found out that basically in the first sweep of the world, when H1N1 came, the first year it went through the global throughout the world, it actually infected about 24% of the global population. That's about 1 in 4 persons in the whole wide world. That's 1.6 billion people. The US seasonal flu itself infects roughly about 19 to 26 million people. However, both these viruses have very low mortality rate. For H1N1, it's estimated to be between 151,000 to 575,000. Although the numbers look large, the percentage are very low. It's very low, 0.02. Likewise, for the US seasonal flu, it's 10 to 25,000 people, which is again 0.05%. Yeah, so while the numbers look large, the actual percentage is low, but the rate of infection is very high. Okay. And of course, we have this last one, which is called the Spanish flu. This is the worst case scenario, whereby you have highly infectious disease with a very high mortality rate. So back then, in the early 1900s, what we had basically about 1/3 of global population being infected. Global population back then was very low, about 1.5 billion, and unlike today, it's about 7 billion, and a very high number of deaths. Mortality was about 10% like SARS, so about 50 million, it is estimated that 50 million people died in the Spanish flu. Okay. For the COVID-19, 2019 novel coronavirus, before it was named COVID-19, this is more or less now acknowledged to be like H1N1 rather than SARS. I think this is an important distinction. I think first of all, many scientists, we have the government of Singapore coming out to say that it's clearly emerging that the characteristics are more similar to H1N1 than SARS. From a market perspective, this is very important, because when the virus first started to come out, you could see almost every research house compare the virus to SARS. So basically what has happened was a lot of the discounting in the market has discounted a lot with respect to the virus looking like SARS. And now as it emerges that the virus isn't like SARS, i.e. it has a much higher infection rate, the markets are slowly turning around and starting to discount this new news or this new information, and I think that's causing volatility in the market. So basically, we spoke about it in our February 7 release, where we said that growing evidence is it's going to be like H1N1 rather than SARS. I know it's a lot of charts, but it's important to understand the time frame that this virus could be active, so that we have a rough idea, or in terms of later on how we estimate what we think is the length of time the markets may be under pressure and such. If we start out with the top charts, those are the charts for SARS in Singapore, Taiwan and Hong Kong, and the bottom one is the Ebola outbreak. What you'll find is that the daily cases, the number of daily cases in almost all virus outbreaks are more or less following a similar pattern. It's called an evolution, the evolution of the virus. It goes up exponentially, it peaks and it starts to come off. If I just do what we call if you look at the top chart and you look at the daily cases, the purple lines are basically the total accumulated cases. The red dots below, where I'm going to call up now these lines, yeah, these are daily cases, similar to the bottom chart. So you can see it's almost a similar type of pattern, whereby it increases for a couple of months, peaks and then comes off. So by and large now, scientists are expecting COVID-19 to follow a similar pattern of increasing, peaking and coming off. In SARS, it took roughly about 3 to 4 months to move up that initial curve, peak, and then another 3 to 4 months to come down. In Ebola, it was much longer, about 11 months to 12 months to move up and then to come down. Currently, we don't really know how long it will take COVID-19, although there are increasingly scientific papers to suggest that in Wuhan itself, we may be approaching, or we may even have peaked as the number of cases come off. So basically that would suggest December, January, February, a 3-month up, and later on maybe a 3-month down. If we plot this on a chart, what you will see is basically something like this. In Hubei, maybe in even Wuhan itself, in January, February, March, it starts to peak and then it comes off April, May, then June. Okay. But the thing is this, while the situation in Hubei and Wuhan may have actually peaked, we must understand that the virus itself has been exported to other places, and these places start at a later date. So basically countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, Korea, Japan, they will start probably in February, based on this estimate, peak probably in April and then start coming down. Other regions like the US, Europe, Latin America, UK, these probably will be at the latter stage, starting to move up in March, peak in May and start coming off. So what this basically means, if you believe that the virus will cause an extensive shutdown risk, as we mentioned in the first episode, and all these curves, especially on the way up, represent a huge amount of shutdown risk, because countries will be quarantining people, they may sometimes use draconian measures and so on and so forth, then basically what we could conclude is that there's a high chance that the first half of 2020 from an economic standpoint could be a wipeout, because as the numbers increase, psychologically, individuals, corporations, countries, governments, they would be more or less in panic mode. And this panic mode, as you see from this chart, will be initially the red line, and then the black line, dotted line, and then the green dotted line. So it's a continuation. The big risk is that from an economic standpoint, things could be on a standstill or at a standstill at least for the next 1 or even 2 quarters from this perspective. So again, the problem with COVID-19 is not the mortality, but actually it's the spread of the virus. A lot of people have mentioned that the mortality is low and therefore you don't have to worry about the virus itself, of catching it. But the issue with that is, if you look at the numbers that we have today, about 80% of people who get COVID-19 have mild symptoms. About 13-14% will have severe symptoms, and about 5% will have critical symptoms, and of this about 1% or 2% will die. Okay, so it's not a question to us, or to me, it's not a question of the mortality rate, it's the question of this 13.8 and 4.7, which makes up roughly about 20%. So if I put it in terms of a diagram, okay, first thing first is you will have the COVID-19 infect a population. The big question mark is, does it infect 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, or even 60% of a population? That's the big question mark. There are studies and there are papers which suggest it could range anything between 20 to even up to 60%, because we must understand this is a virus which is going through the population for the very first time. No one has immunity to it. When we take that infected population and we break it down in terms of percentages, or let's say for example for every 100,000 people infected, the 80% ratio would suggest 80% of people will only have minor symptoms without the need for hospitalization. Okay, so basically not an issue in terms of to their health, so much so that they need to go to hospital. But there will be 15% which will need to go to hospital. These are the people who may need oxygen and so on and so forth, and out of which 5% will be critical and require intensive care, ICU. So basically we're talking about out of 100,000 people, about 20,000 will need hospitalization, of which 5,000 will need close care. But the problem with this also is that while the 80% may have minor symptoms, the 80% remain contagious. They continue to spread the disease, and we'll talk about what we call asymptomatic spread. But again, these people remain infectious. So it is again something which is very hard to clamp down on, because of the fact that while people have minor symptoms, they remain contagious. So big question now is basically this number of infected. Like I mentioned, some studies say 24, some studies even go all the way up to 60, or people have mentioned about 60. Okay, but it is the number of people that are infected which will be the issue. It is not the mortality rate. And why is it the number of people infected is going to be an issue? Because it has a psychological effect. You're talking about a virus which out of 10 people, you're worried that for the 2 who may be infected, out of 100, there's 80 who will be mild and 20 who will undergo what we call the need for hospitalization. And that 20 itself, when they are in need of hospitalization, it could be a case of 14%, and these are numbers coming out from scientific reports. 14% of cases have pneumonia, shortness of breath, and this is where sometimes you see the videos of hospitals in Wuhan with a lot of people with holding on to, or rather a lot of oxygen tanks in the hospitals and such. Yeah, that's the reason for it. And 5 of the cases we will have something called respiratory failure, septic shock, multi-organ failure, and respiratory distress, the ARDS. Yeah. We have already stories of how people, while they survive, they go through tremendous stress on their bodies because of this. So the fact of the matter is, because we don't know who falls in the 20%. Of course, if you're old, if you have underlying illnesses, if you are unhealthy and stuff, there's a higher chance of you getting it. But at the same time, there are cases of people who are not in this category getting the COVID-19. I think this fear itself will drive into the population and cause what we call a shutdown risk. From an individual perspective, people will stay home, people will spend less, people will start taking precautions and not going out and not going to the shopping centers, not going to the restaurants and stuff. Because in the first year itself, you don't know whether you are in that 20%. Of course, in the second year itself, when we have vaccines, and a lot of people would have built immunity, having taken the vaccine or having gone through knowing that you're in that 80% who has built up natural immunity, you're not scared. It's like influenza. Today, if I got influenza, I wouldn't feel scared because I've had it before. I've had the flu jab before, and I know how it feels, and I know it won't kill me. But currently, because this is a new virus, many people will be extremely cautious because they are not sure of this particular virus. It's the first time ever it's out in the open. Okay, so this is basically one of the psychological impact that the virus will have on consumption, which again goes back to the economy and goes back to the markets and so on and so forth. This virus, basically, we have to understand it is absolutely difficult to stop. So it will make its way, despite the fact that we have quarantines and so on. Even the Chinese quarantines itself, while has slowed down the spread of the virus, has not totally stopped it, because this virus is different from other viruses like SARS, which only began to be infectious after a person showed symptoms, whereas this virus, COVID-19, you can be infectious even before you show symptoms, which is what the medical line calls as asymptomatic a patient or condition, where you spread the virus even before showing any symptoms. And that makes the virus almost impossible to stop, because you're not sure whether someone is carrying the virus because the person doesn't show any symptoms. There are talks about the virus being airborne and stuff. There is a huge debate going on, but again, these are things which slowly we're beginning to understand the virus. We're talking about, for example, questions with regards to how did the virus spread on the Diamond Princess, the cruise ship. We're talking about all these things which sometimes suggest it is airborne, sometimes it's not. So all of these things will just add on to the fear of the unknown, which is what I've actually alluded to as to the title. So we know the actual numbers. 80% will be mild, 20% will be severe, but what we don't know is whether we'll fall into that group of that 20%, and I think that's the key thing which will impact the consumer going ahead. This is just a chart from the World Health Organization. Started off in China, we know, and it's spreading, and you will expect and do expect more red dots to permeate across this globe here. So having said that, where I'm coming to is basically, I think that equity markets have actually underestimated the risks of this virus. They've underestimated first by discounting the fact that it was going to look like SARS, which it isn't, and secondly now is the fact that this virus can actually infect a lot of people. We've never had this kind of shutdown risks at these kind of unprecedented levels before, which means that it's very hard to model what the slowdown will be, how bad it will be. So basically that's something that we really need to look out for. And there's something which we must also understand is the fact that COVID-19 has appeared at what we call the late stages of the current economic cycle. If you look at SARS, bird flu, swine flu, Ebola, even Zika, these appeared at the early stage and even the mid stage of the economic cycle. But now, by and large, everybody's agreeing to the fact that this is we're in this late stage, and the fact that this thing comes at the late stage really makes it a bit more impactful, because again, it could cause the consumer, which is the last standing pillar of the global economy, to be the carpet to be pulled from under the consumer's feet, causing what we call a reverse in the cycle. Yeah. So we'll talk about that a bit more later in the next episode. I'll just like to end it here. Please do subscribe to our channel if you find this useful, and you'll be updated with regards to future presentations. Thank you.